it, so I'm going to be out for a little
Oh,
bit.
congratulations.
Yeah.
Is that public?
Um,
I mean, I guess
ish.
relatively. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I
So
don't think I'm special enough to get like the super insider info on that.
yeah, I've been buzzing around traveling a bunch
Yeah.
earlier this year up until now. So it's gonna be nice to just,
Slow down a little bit.
yeah, chill for a little bit.
Yeah. Dude, that's exciting. This is your first?
Yes.
That's cool. We have a 14-month-old now. So that was a little over a year ago that we had Jamie, and it's been a lot of fun, a lot of stress, but also like Jess, my wife works for Aussiro doing events and travels
Mhm.
a pretty good amount for them.
Mhm.
And sometimes we overlap at her working events, me speaking events, which is really, really nice, but it's much more difficult for us to both go.
Yeah.
Anyways, like finding that balance of like traveling and paying attention to the burden of the other one who stays at home, like all that
Yeah.
stuff is tough.
Oh, yeah.
So yeah, I don't know. I'm excited though.
Thank you. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's gonna be fun.
cool. Mike is on YouTube. What's up, Mike? We'll have some people join us eventually, but I just wanted to take like every minute that we could to do like kind of deep dive questions. So if people have questions in the chat, let us know about Next.js, just general topics. And you were quick to clarify server components, like the difference between server components being React versus the implementation of that inside of Next.js, which I think is a great call out.
Mhm.
Caching, streaming, a couple of different things.
Mhm.
You got a huge fan from Kenya. We got Chris Wicks on Twitch. Amazing. So one of the questions that I've seen a few times, and I actually asked you this, you sent me a response and a DM to an article, but I still think there's a little bit of details to potentially cover is the impact of streaming, like
Mhm.
with server components on SEO. And so the article, I'll grab a link and put it in the chat, was written by Guillermo, I believe. And basically the answer was streaming is not negatively affected by server components. And the reason there's the question is because of you send back a response to the browser or bot or whatever, and then you continue to send other stuff. So how exactly does Google slash any other bot know exactly when all that data is finished, like the streaming is done?
Mhm. Yeah, even stepping back before server components, so just streaming anything on the
Hmm.
web, whether it was some older school servers as well, at a certain point, the size of a website, streaming kind of becomes inevitable. Like there's really no way for Google to compute all the different variations of the weather widget that it needs to
Mm,
send, or the, local sports game in your area, the football match. And I think that's not to say that streaming is only good for the massive sites on the web, because it actually can be helpful for performance on all sites, and we can get to that. But what it means is that they had to find a way to make the crawlers intelligent enough to handle streamed content,
hmm.
because obviously they wouldn't self-sabotage themselves with Google, like, oh man, we got to stream all this content and it
Yep.
can't get indexed by our crawler. It was a little counterintuitive to me at first, because I kind of had that same,
Hmm.
I think a lot of people had that intuition of like,
Right.
is it possible for the crawler to be smart enough to
Yep.
wait for all that content to come back in? And the answer is yeah, like crawlers have actually gotten really good at waiting for the page to finish
Cool.
streaming all the content. And there's really two parts to SEO here. There's a lot of parts to SEO, but two parts. One is like waiting to crawl the page and get all the content. But the other one is now Google more heavily weighs performance in terms of core web vitals. So
Mm,
the other interesting bit here is that being able to stream for a lot of websites will actually help improve core web vitals, because you're getting a lot of the render blocking stuff and you're kind of pushing it down
yep.
in priority on the page to try to get something back to the user as fast as possible. So whether that's a faster initial paint, or hopefully getting your site be interactive faster as well, it's good for that. And you can see it when you look like at these large sites that are using streaming, they're still doing well being indexed on
Yep.
Google.
Cool. Yeah, it makes sense. And I was kind of doing some digging into just raw streaming in general, and it seems like there's like you send back an initial response with a 200, I think,
Yep.
and you send some sort of header that indicates we're going to be streaming, and then as you're streaming chunks, there's a final stream of like a 0 byte content or whatever that signifies the end of streaming. So is that how like the bot or crawler or whatever knows like, hey, I received the final 0-bit thing and now I know we're done. I've got everything.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know exactly how Google's crawler does it. They won't publish exactly what it does, but theoretically, yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yep.
Really, like in terms of how streaming works, going back to you have a request and you need to produce a response, whether you're using Node APIs or you're using like the web APIs, like making a readable stream, you can basically send 200 and get some content back fast, and then progressively send chunks of content. So I say hello, and then I wait for 2 seconds, and I say world, and then I wait for 2 seconds. And you keep that stream open as you're giving content back from the server. This is like in order streaming, you'll call it, hear it referred to. So you're kind of waiting for the content to come in the same order it was sent. One of the interesting things about server components is that it can support out of order streaming, which is pretty powerful because the way you're defining where you want content to be streamed in your application is through React suspense boundaries. So the initial response that comes back basically has placeholders that are defined by your suspense boundaries that tell React, hey, here are where the dynamic bits are, and here's where you need to stream in and fill those holes, which is pretty cool.
And there's a little bit of, so this jumping down to another question that I have is one of the benefits of server components in theory is there's no additional JavaScript sent with that. Like it's rendered on the server. We'll get into caching in a second. It's rendered on the server and it doesn't need hydration code because it's not using useState. It's not using useEffect. It's not doing any of that like React JavaScripty stuff on the front end. But there is some amount of like a small amount of JavaScript that figures out how to take the placeholders and like replace the content that's streamed with the loading indicator as an example in that suspense boundary. Is that right?
So there's 2 bits here. The first one on how React is able to swap out the chunks of there was a placeholder for some content and then we're able to stream in and replace the content. That's, in my opinion, that's the big advantage of now having React have more of an opinion about how you can use the server and giving these primitives to frameworks to be able to use to build on top of. So the server is the one who's able to make that distinction of, okay, I had this template, this like hole, and I can go in and I can then stream in and replace that content. But the second part of your question is like, what does that mean for the amount of JavaScript that's shipped to the browser? Because I feel like when server components first came out, 2020, when it was just experimental, like a technology preview, I think the messaging at the time, and I probably didn't help this either because I was excited about shipping less JavaScript as a whole, and I think that's still true. I just feel like over time I've now realized it isn't the main goal. And what I mean is, it's not that you want to have all server components or all client components. It's really the harmony of how they work together that is what's special about the model. The big problem it's solving, it's not about like bytes of JavaScript, but it's from getting away from requiring blocking scripts to instead, when you stream in content, you can get visual content to the screen faster without having to wait for the scripts to load, so things can be interactive immediately. So also, which is neat, is that React can basically like replay the events. So if you click a button and the JavaScript hasn't loaded in yet because you have a client component for some other client interactivity, React basically knows how to replay that event so you never lose that tap, which is kind of nice. So it kind of has this progressive enhancement built in now.
That was something I just came across in the server actions for forms. Is that if you click, and this is really interesting, and this would maybe be a deeper dive because I've been doing a lot of form, just diving into form options for validation, client, server, etc. But if you use an action and the JavaScript hasn't fully loaded yet and you click submit, it queues that up. So it must have some sort of like inline JavaScript or something that queues up those events, or maybe that's something that React just handles. And then it plays those out after.
Yeah, it's nice that this isn't a extra thing that you have to configure. It's like
Mhm.
the library and the framework are just kind of doing that out of the box now, which is really nice.
Yeah.
The only other thing to add to the like JavaScript size conversation is that I do think it's important to talk through the trade-off though, because the trade-off of streaming is that you're going to have a larger document size. So you got rid of having these blocking scripts so that you could make your page visually complete faster and not block
Mhm.
interactivity. But when you're streaming, you're progressively adding more into the HTML, right? It's getting bigger and bigger and you're pushing more content in over time. And I still think that's a good trade-off, but it doesn't come for free basically. So
Okay.
you do have a larger document size.
Okay. But I guess the counter argument to that though is like that document size would have been that big if you were just doing server side rendering. Like what becomes the full document size eventually with streaming would have been the original document size with server side rendering, right? Is that fair?
Yeah, that's fair. The additional bit that I think folks are surprised to see when they see how the sausage is made of a server components app is they see what is called the RSC payload, which
Yeah.
is like just a bunch of script tags at the
Mhm.
bottom of the page. And when you dig in there, it's like you see
Mm.
all this weird JSON of all this information.
Yep.
It's basically how the server and client components communicate together. And that's kind of going back to your question, like, how does it know how to
Right.
fill the holes where that dynamic content was? That's where you see like there's just a bunch of these
Mm.
what feel like machine code instructions down there. And I think there's more still to do that we could like compress or condense that payload so that the document size isn't as big. But I've seen a
Yep.
couple discussions where people are like, is this necessary? Like, do we have to do this? And it's like, yeah, actually, that's like the key thing. That's
Right.
like the message system between the parts.
Yep. Yeah, just to reiterate that for everybody listening, like there has to be logic somewhere that takes in the browser you have this suspense boundary loading component. And then when the new thing streams in to replace that, there has to be logic to handle that incoming bit of data to know what original placeholder slot, whatever you want to call it,
Yep.
it's meant to replace, and then to go and actually replace that. So there is logic and a mapping, and that includes like just just the actual data for it too, right? Like it's
Yes.
markup and data for the component to be able to be replaced. So there's logic and code that goes into that.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Um, Sweet. There are several different questions. There's a bunch of different ways we can take this. One I think is really interesting from Fab Mastery. I'm going back a little bit. Asking about Next.js being slow in development versus and in comparison to maybe being deployed. And one thing I didn't know,
Mm-hmm.
I didn't understand, I didn't know that the caching stuff was happening by default with Next.js 14. We'll talk more about caching. And
Mm-hmm.
so I never experienced, like I added a piece of data to my database and then didn't see it show up in my deployed website because it was already cached. We'll talk about that more in a second. But general idea that maybe this leads to is like in development mode, you're not doing all of that caching because it doesn't make sense from a development standpoint, which
Yeah.
means you're kind of rebuilding those pages every time, which makes that process a little bit slower.
Yes,
Okay.
there's two big things here. The first is the mental model between local dev versus
Mhm.
production. In local dev, you want things to be as on demand as possible. You wouldn't want to start your
Yep.
dev server and compile,
Yeah.
potentially hundreds or thousands of pages in your application, or try to pre-render a bunch of those pages either. So when you request a page, Next.js compiles the page on demand, but also, and I feel like Next could do a better job of displaying this in the logs. When that also means doing the data fetching for the
Mhm.
page. So if
Yep.
you're loading a page, you're compiling it on demand, you're fetching the data, and your database takes 5 seconds to respond, it feels like your app is really slow.
Mhm.
But really, you're doing a lot to happen there because the page hasn't been potentially pre-rendered or cached yet. So that's like one piece of it. The other piece of it is that Next.js has been around since 2016 now. There's been growing number of applications of really large size and complexity get built over time. And as that complexity grows, like we've seen some customers come to us with just ridiculously sized Next.js apps. And when they get to
Mhm.
that point, the current set of bundling tools just isn't handling it very well. Definitely not Webpack, which is why we've been investing in TurboPack for almost a couple of
Mhm.
years now, making this foundation better. So that's like the other bit for the large apps is to make things faster as well. And it should be fully stable for local dev here very soon. It's at 100% of our tests passing in our test suite. So if you try out Next.dev --turbo.
So that's TurboPack you're referring to, which replaces Webpack as the bundler?
Yep.
Cool.
Yeah, Webpack will be around for a while in Next because there's so many apps that still depend on it. But what we're trying to do is like rebuild the plane while flying. Like we want to be able to use Next.dev-turbo, use TurboPack, and get all the little bits kind of figured out.
Yeah. Sweet. Cool. There was another question about caching.
Yep.
In terms of what will break when migrating to Next 15. So there's a big difference between 14 and 15. Maybe start with 14, and basically the idea of a lot of stuff is cached by default. So what types of things can be cached automatically, and then what was happening in 14 versus 15?
Yeah, and I think we can tie it to Chris's question down below too, which is like, how do I approach caching when writing components? Like what's the mental model we should go through? Because I think with the past, let's see, has it been a year and a half, I think, that we've had folks building with the app router since it's been out.
That's crazy.
We've gotten a ton of feedback about what people like, what they don't like. And when you think about it, Next Pages Router has been around since 2016, but App Router is like a whole new framework within a framework where people can start trying it out.
Yeah.
And that feedback has been really helpful because when you start out a framework, you're going to move really fast and change a bunch of things. And we're trying to do this delicate balance of, we want to move fast and change things, but not too fast because people are depending on Next. So I think the biggest bit of feedback that we've gotten is the model that we shipped for caching to start was probably too strict or too aggressive. And it broke some of the intuitions of how you would expect it to work. Yeah. So the way that I would expect things to work, just if I wiped my memory clean, Men in Black style of how everything worked, is you write code that feels dynamic. I'm going to go grab some data from my database. I'm going to do something that calls an external API. I would expect that information to be up to date every time I reload the page. I think that's like, make a request, I get a response. Like it feels very embedded in what folks expect.
Absolutely.
And with the Next 14 model, there was this combination of kind of trying to make your site as fast as possible by caching fetches or trying to pre-render as much of your page as you could. And it just kind of broke that mental model a little bit. So the big change
exactly what it was for me. Yeah,
totally. So the big change with Next 15 is that fetches are not cached by default. We've kind of removed the default for this client router cache, which we can talk a little bit more about what that does. And same thing with route handlers, which are kind of like API routes. And what that means is that more often now, when you're writing code that you expect to be dynamic, your page will be dynamic. There's still one part to tease out here that this is the next chapter in us evolving how we teach the app router is there's still pre-rendering. So when you run a build, what Next.js is going to try to do is make as much of the page static as possible. And in the model today, if you're using something that's dynamic, if I write await prisma dot whatever, and I'm going to go to my database and fetch something, well, the whole page is dynamic. So we don't want to have this big drop off of, okay, some parts of my page are going to be dynamic and I want to go fetch data. And even though like 50% of the page was just static HTML components, basically, I still want those to be really fast. So we're trying to tackle this in both ways. For the second part, trying to mix the best parts of static and dynamic. This is where we're moving forward with what we've called partial pre-rendering.
That's something I need to learn more about. Yeah.
Yeah. The big idea is like, okay, in a world where you write code that it looks dynamic and feels dynamic because you want to go fetch data from your database, what if that only affected just that one component, right? If I've got a bunch of other stuff on the page that looks like just mostly static markup, could we just extract all of that stuff and make it part of the initial response? And it's funny because we go back to the stuff we talked about earlier with streaming and leaving holes for the content, and how React Suspense can define those holes, and how React then knows how to fill in the holes. All of that applies exactly to this.
Mhm.
It's just that that initial response that you stream back, instead of it being something that's empty, what React and Next can do in the render process, in the build process, so when they run Next build, is create this static pre-render of as much of the page as possible. So if it's a marketing page, right, it might be 90% of the page you can make to the static pre-render that you stream initially from the server, but then only that user account circle in the top right, just that component is the only one that runs dynamically and is defined by a suspense boundary that goes around the component.
And this is like, I was actually watching keynote about Astro and their server islands, and this kind of changed my mental model about what we're talking about, because there's a difference between serving quote unquote static markup from a CDN versus your actual server.
Yep.
And so with Next.js 14, for example, if you have a server component, and unless you're using like query parameters or a few other things, that whole page gets fully cached on a CDN, which breaks a little bit of the mental model of like, if I'm writing code that queries from a database, I don't necessarily expect it to be cached. Now it's different by default. But the idea of caching that and having that be a static page that lives on a CDN versus even if you're using server components and you're able to send back markup while then streaming additional data later, all that's happening from your server versus an actual CDN. Right? Is this... Well, that's a big difference.
Yeah, I think so going back to kind of how it works today is if you use some things that we determine to be dynamic, you try to read something from the incoming requests, basically like query parameters or other bits. Basically the entire page runs dynamically. So if you're self-hosting, that's running on your server in US East, or if you're using a provider like Vercel, it's running on one of our functions in one of our whatever region you specify. Where we're going with partial pre-rendering that is a little bit different than other solutions is that there's kind of two different bits. There's the self-hosted bit, which you can talk about, and then there's the Vercel bit. On Vercel, because we have a CDN, what the region can do, let's say for me, there's a region in US Central. What that region can do is when it streams back the initial response that includes as much of the page as possible, not only can it do that, but it can also kick off in parallel fetching the other information on the page. So fetching the dynamic calls to go to my database and get information and fetch that and then stream it back in. All of that can happen at the same time. Like the CDN basically kicks all of that off, and it can basically append things to that same stream. So it's all in the same request.
So that request, like if I send a request to get a page that is not fully cached, that uses server components, I am going to get that initial markup from a CDN, like that is accessible around the world.
Yep.
And then that CDN is going to make from the CDN, it's going to make a request to a database somewhere else and then stream that back in. Yeah.
So for example, I run a build and I generate a static pre-render of the majority of my page. Let's call it 90% of the page. What's going to happen on Vercel is we're going to deploy those static pages to all of the different CDN regions.
Yeah.
And then as a user, I make a request to a region. I get to get back that initial static page, just like a normal static site, forever. But then also the CDN is going to go to our origin, wherever that's at, our database or wherever our function is running, and kicks off the rest of the dynamic parts at the same time. So let's go to my function. It's going to go talk to our database, fetch the number of users, and then stream those back to our page. Really what it's trying to do is just reduce the number of waterfalls. So rather than having to go from server to browser, okay, we're in the browser, the JavaScript is loaded. Okay, now let's go back to the server so we can go to the database, and then we'll return it back over here. It's like just trying to streamline that process.
I may have to let this go because I'm still kind of mind blown if what you're saying, if I'm understanding what you're saying correctly. They're like, even without a fully static page, and I make that request to that page, and it does need to load some data to return back to me the final thing, I'm still accessing that through a CDN initially. So that static part of that page is going to come back to me from the CDN.
Yeah. Yeah. If you go to partialprerendering.com, we have
this is specifically with partial pre-rendering.
Yeah, this is basically where Next.js is headed in the next year.
Right. Okay. But so without partial pre-rendering, that would
Without
not
partial
be the case.
pre-rendering, the whole thing would be dynamic.
Okay. Yes. Okay. That makes total sense. And that is exactly what I thought my understanding was of PPR going forward. Makes total sense. Okay.
Yes.
That helps a lot. So, and that absolutely is the dream, because if you're not accessing the static part from a CDN, you're going from Japan to US East, if that's where the application is hosted.
Yep.
To start doing the server-side rendering, even if with the server-side rendering, you have the benefit of sending the skeleton first and streaming in stuff, it's still coming from way far away to start. Okay. Yes, that makes perfect sense. And that is super, super exciting for PPR as well. That's huge.
Absolutely.
Okay, cool. That is amazing. I want to make sure I'm respectful of your time. We're like at our original 30 minutes. How many more minutes do you comfortably have? Not to put you on the spot too much.
Yeah, let's go for another 5. Let's answer some more questions in the chat.
Cool. Let's see. There was a question about testing streaming from Mike. Any tips for end-to-end testing with streaming?
I guess it really just depends on what you're looking for. Like if you're doing an end-to-end test and you're waiting for an element to be visible on the page, just like you would use with a Playwright or Cypress, you tag something by a test ID, and then you can have await for test ID to be visible. And then you're basically waiting for your server to stream in that bit.
So you're doing awaits based on IDs of elements that should be coming.
Totally.
Cool.
Yep.
Semi-funny comment, can't wait for Next.js to become a boring framework. Basically the idea of like things have changed a lot, and I think that's fair.
Yeah.
But I see from my perspective, like it's settling down on this idea of kind of the streaming and then combined with PPR going forward. That seems like something from an outsider's perspective that's going to be the way we do it for a while.
Yeah, and I feel this on a deep level because there's been a lot of change in the past 3 years with new things being added to Next. And it's a delicate balance, right? You want to introduce new things because you kind of have to disrupt yourself. You have to introduce new ideas. Otherwise, it just becomes stagnant, and it's the only way that you've ever built. And then eventually something new comes along and you're like, well, let's move to that thing instead. We're trying to like bring the new ideas along to Next as it grows. And what that means for a lot of people is like, yeah, this seems cool, but like, I'm going to stick with the pages router for a couple more years because I don't want to even think about this stuff. And that's totally fine if you don't really want to be on the bleeding edge or try some of these latest features. So we're now starting to get to a point, a year and a half in of the app router, and like really listening to a bunch of feedback on what's working and what's not working for the model to start to click for a lot more people, I think. And as the general React ecosystem is growing with server component stuff, and more people are understanding what server components are, what client components are. Is this stuff even helpful? Especially with React 19, you're starting to see the bits of the work that's happened on the server make their way to the client too, which I just did a video on this. It's on the Vercel YouTube channel, but it's showing like all of the hooks that you were trying with forms, like actions and, use optimistic or use action state or use form state. These all work on the client too, which is just mind blowing to me. Even if I'm building a Vite app, it's like a client only app, I can still do all of that. And then if I want to shift some of that to the server, I can. It's the same model, basically.
Yeah. It's really, really cool to see. And especially, I think the Next.js implementation and embracing of this type of stuff. I did have maybe one last question to finish on, and it's the idea of like, you can't have a server component inside of a client component. And the documentation is there around that. But it kind of, to me, just says like, you can't do it unless you pass it in as a child component. What I don't quite understand, and I'm curious if theoretically it makes sense. Like if I have a server component, is there not some way the bundler can know to ship a client component and still have JavaScript in there that knows, hey, I have something else to get from the server, and then that data gets translated to like an API endpoint. It can make a fetch endpoint to get back that markup and then put it in. Like in theory, is that possible?
Yeah. So The way that helps me understand the composition of server and client components is a client component is basically saying that I want to also include a script tag to do something in the browser.
Mhm.
Because client components, maybe not the best name, but they're also pre-rendered, right?
Yeah, and that I forget about that sometimes too.
I forget about it too, to be
Yeah.
honest. Like it is a little confusing.
Yeah.
I think over time it will be more easy
Yeah.
to understand. But at first it's like, wait, is this client side
Is it?
rendering
Yeah.
or? But so the model that's helped me is basically if I go into a file and I mark it as use client, I'm saying to my bundler basically this is an entry point from the server to the client graph to the
Mhm.
client side of my application. So stop, make a script tag, and we're going to include some scripts for this component.
And would that
And
script be like what would be an example of that script? Like whatever JavaScript it needs for that component specifically?
yeah, so like I've got, the quintessential counter component that's use client at the top because it has some state and
State,
effect.
yeah.
So I've got my page, which is a server component, like the entry to my application.
Mhm.
I like weave into, I have a child that is the client
Client
component.
component,
It
yeah.
has use client at the top. So the bundler is like, okay, I see that. Now let's go and make a script tag to include this information on the page because it was already going to like trace everything and build the pre-render of all of the
Mhm.
HTML. But the bundler then says, okay, and I also need to run some client-side JavaScript because of this. So that's helped me understand how to define client components. But then the part that I think I'm still trying to figure out the best way to explain is that you can have this basically weaving of you have a server component on the top, then it renders a client component, but the children of a client component can be server components.
Mhm.
A good example of this is React context providers. So you probably have used something that required you to put a context provider around your application,
Yep.
like global tooltips or Toast or
Yep.
something. And the way this can work in a server components application is you have like the first response is always a server component. So you're always starting on the server. But then the next thing that it renders could be a client component and it like has this shell around everything that all it's doing is just setting up context providers. And then the children of that thing, the children of the context provider can be the rest of the application. And the rest of the application could be 95% server components. So
Okay.
it kind of breaks some of the maybe initial assumptions of like, okay, so if I mark this as use server, then like everything below here
Right.
is a client
Is
component
server.
or use
Use
client.
client
Yeah,
and
yeah.
yeah, yep.
Which also is funnily enough, another, I think, misconception that makes sense is like, wait, is use server the opposite of use client? Because, the names kind of feel like opposites. In reality, use server is like, I want to go create an endpoint automatically that I can make a post request to. So if I have a server component and I'm just fetching some data, I don't have to say for that function that I'm fetching data, oh, go use server, because I'm not making a post to that. I'm making a get to that. I'm going, I don't even have to make
Mhm.
a separate API. I just call the function because I'm already on the server. Use server is like, hey, I want to go scaffold an API and I can call that from a client or server component. It's just like taking some of the boilerplate out of like setting up the separate API and then doing the use effect to call fetch,
Yep.
to call localhost 3000 / API. Yeah.
Yep. Cool. That like I could go a lot deeper. I'm sure people could too, but I also want to be respectful of your time. That was super, super helpful though.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe we could do a follow-up at some point. I would love
Yeah.
to continue to one of my goals is to do like a deeper dive into Next.js.
Yeah, I would
Um,
love to. I mean, there's so much more we can go in depth on some
yep.
of these things, especially even getting our hands on the code. And like we try to
Yeah.
build something because it's fun to see, like, okay, let me comment out use client. Okay, so that's how that
That's
works.
where yeah. I think that's always the biggest thing for me is like making it real by experiencing
Mhm.
the trade-offs, especially like performance when you think about server components is actually looking in the network tab and seeing what's happening and seeing
Mhm.
time to first byte, etc.
Mhm.
Yeah, anyway, thank you again for joining. If anybody in the chat, thank you to Lee
Yeah, if
as
anyone
well.
in the chat has more questions too, like James and I can do another follow up, and you can
Yeah.
also always tweet me on or post me on X, and I'll happy to answer questions and talk more about this stuff.
I can't not say tweet and Twitter.
You know, tweet's gonna
it's
be
been
around
too
forever.
long.
I'm sorry, Elon, but like
it's been too long.
tweet's
I know.
pretty good.
Yep. Cool, man. Well, great to talk to you as well. Hopefully we'll get to catch up just more in general in the future. I'll let you drop out. I'm going to stay on, and then if people have like questions and stuff that we can talk about without Lee, feel free to put them in the chat too. But thanks again, man. It's good to see you.
Thank you. See ya.
Yeah. Sweet. Yeah, I'm glad we got to the point where the partial pre-rendering, we got to talk about that, and I got to have that oh wow moment of comparing what is the difference between kind of taking advantage of server-side rendering, or excuse me, streaming components with server-side rendering now versus what it will be in the future. The info on the client server stuff is still really interesting to me. Fab on YouTube said it's too short. I agree. I would love to have like 2.5 hours to talk to Lee. He's also has other things happening, so we can potentially do a part 2 as well. But I also want to be really respectful of his time. But he's so good at giving back to the community and this sort of stuff. So I'm really appreciative of him joining. Chris said, interesting that the server component cannot still access the context provider. Yeah, context providers, I think, really do still break my brain. But so the idea, so yes, they do break my brain. But the idea that server component can't access what's in a context provider does make sense, because a server component does not have client-side JavaScript. And one of the things I wanted to clarify with him is when we think about, he was talking about like use client being a marker for like, hey, there needs to be a JavaScript bundle for this. My thought is that JavaScript bundle is basically the hydration code that component needs to be able to run its logic. Because if you look at like, and this is a key thing too with client components, is client components are still rendered on the server. And I forget that. But client components are still rendered on the server. And then it has hydration code that then adds the interactiveness to it after when it gets to the browser. So I'm imagining that bundle that gets set aside for that client component is then used for hydration. Now, if a client component then has a child that is a server component, by the time it gets to the browser, it's a pre-rendered thing. It doesn't have JavaScript. So it then can't access things that are tracked in JavaScript, like context provider stuff. So Fab said, great streaming. Appreciate it. Yeah, anytime I get to talk to Lee is a big deal and a lot of fun. Michael said context providers are just a global store. They are, but the key thing being they are in memory in JavaScript, and server components, by the time they get to the browser, are not having access to JavaScript. Would it be cool if server components did have a way to speak to client though? Now that, that's asking a lot. I did wonder if there was a way that you could ship a client component with a server component inside of it. So here's a different take. Server islands in Astro, the way I understand them, instead of doing streaming to do this like streaming in of asynchronous data, server islands in Astro do HTTP requests, which I think does enable some things here. In theory, like if you had a marker inside of your application, inside of a client component in general in Next.js, if you had a marker in there that said like server component, you could make an HTTP request to get that server component. So that would allow you to nest a server component inside of a client component, send that to the browser, then inside of that client component that then has a server component, instead of it being initially rendered on the server, it could be a HTTP request back to the server to get the markup from that server component. This is probably super confusing. That's basically the paradigm that Astro is going with for server islands, is my understanding. Since Next.js is not doing the HTTP request, it doesn't have the setup, for my understanding, to be able to do that, because it actually needs to be like on the server to send back a placeholder to then stream data back and then have the information of associating the the streamed in content with the original suspense boundary placeholder type thing. Inception. Yeah, this is like really kind of wild to try to wrap your mind around. But the idea that you're wrapping, so when you use a context provider inside of layout, for example, the reason you're able to then still have server components inside of that is because those are children. They kind of, I guess they kind of still like, I don't know, they still render the same as they would have, and then just are like a piece of markup. I'd actually be curious about this to know. Yeah, I still can't fully wrap my head around that. Michael is saying, isn't it then waiting for the entire client side to load before making the server request, therefore eliminating the benefits of server to begin with? Are you talking about in the Astro server action example? Is that what you mean? Kevin also said, I was working on forms with Next.js the other day. Following tweets you made, Tansec form is pretty good. Seamless integration with ShadCN. Cool. Yeah, I've been doing a lot with forms. I'll create a video on this to show like multiple different ways to do forms and validation client side and server side. And there's a few different packages that go well with it. I did one demo with React Hook form. I think Tansec form is probably similar, but I think Tansec form also does like the fetching involved too. I think so. You can't. I don't know this, but can you combine Tansec form with server actions? I'm not sure. Seamless integration with ShadCN. I'll be honest, I still struggle with ShadCN in Deals for Devs project. When I go back and look at some of our components that are from ShadCN, I just see a bunch of stuff that I don't understand. And part of it's probably just me not having taken the time to really see what's there. But every time I kind of get confused. Michael was saying, from your example and describing the HTTP call to retrieve server code. Yeah, so, Kevin, you can combine Tansec with server actions. Cool. Yeah, I haven't checked that out, but maybe I should. So the idea that you're waiting for the entire client side to load before making server requests. Michael, I think the key thing is so what I was describing with server islands is actually very similar to partial pre-rendering, where you can still send back a static page that has some JavaScript associated, have some placeholders in that markup, and then in that JavaScript, it knows how to make the association of, hey, here's this ID with this information. Here's the fetch request that I need to make back to get that data and then stream it in. So you're not doing like client-side rendering. You're still having a static page with just a vanilla JavaScript file or like some sort of JavaScript file that then knows the associations with placeholders to an API endpoint to make the request back to get that data to then populate it. It's very similar to the idea of HTMX. HTMX makes a request to the server to get back markup and then just drops it in places. So you can serve that static shell. You can serve that from a CDN with just an HTML file and a JavaScript file. In that JavaScript file, it then knows when it loads how to go back and query that data from the server and then drop it in, if that makes sense. So I still think it's actually very, very similar to what Lee was saying with PPR, partial pre-rendering, where you serve the static shell from a CDN, and then it's able to, I don't know how they do it specifically, because it still doesn't sound like it's making the HTTP request. Or not from the way that I think of with server islands. I'm not actually sure. But the same benefit of being able to serve an initial file from a CDN while being able to stream things back to the browser to update loaders, placeholders, etc. So it's making a trade-off of client-side processing versus server request time. Am I understanding that correctly? I don't think that's exactly. I think the really big point is where do you serve your first bit of markup from. So if you look at like super statically, like just a traditional static site generator, it creates a HTML file. That HTML file lives in a CDN. If I'm in Memphis and I make a request, it's going to go and get that from a CDN node in the Eastern United States. If I'm in Japan and I go to make the request to that statically generated file that lives in a CDN, it's going to get that from the node that's closest to me in Japan. So the distance it has to travel to get that initial byte, to get that initial markup with a CDN that replicates stuff all across the world is always going to be faster than if I'm only able to get that initial byte from a server that's in US East 1, for example. So with just regular server-side rendering in Next.js, when it's hosted wherever it's hosted, on Vercel as an example, it's probably US East by default. So if I'm using regular server-side rendering, if I make a request from Memphis, it's not that far to go to US East. But if I make a request from Japan, it has to make a request all the way back over to the the serverless function deployed in US East 1 just to get back the response. Now with server components, you get the benefit of it can respond back with kind of a template HTML first and then stream back additional data. But to get that template HTML, you're still having to go from Japan to US East 1 and back. And then it streams stuff in after. The future server islands and what we're saying with partial pre-rendering is you get the benefit of both worlds. Is you can make the request to a CDN to get back initial markup first, and then somehow it fills in those placeholders with stuff from a server. So your time to first byte from a CDN is almost always going to be faster than time to first byte from a server that lives in one place, in one region, if that makes sense. I think this is a very underrated aspect of performance of the types of things we're talking about, is where does that first byte come from? Coming from a CDN is drastically better than coming from a single server or serverless function deployed in a single region. Does that make sense overall? Maybe other people can chime in too. Mike said I can help with ShadCN used on every project nowadays. Yeah, I really struggle with it, Mike. I might have to get you on. Oh, we still need to do a stream to talk about AI and maybe ShadCN too. I forgot. I haven't followed up on that. I'm sorry. We should go ahead and get that scheduled. Ryan said I currently have a love-hate relationship with ShadCN, but I think it stems from the same place. I feel most confident when I know some code from the ground up. Yeah, I just like really struggle with it. Coder Destin stopped by to say hey. What's up? Stopping by to say hey, or you're telling me to stop by and say hey. Destin's good to virtually see you, man. What else? What's going on with people? Any other like questions, topics in Next.js that we can talk about? The doing forms has been really interesting. Paying attention to progressive enhancement has been really interesting as well. It's also crazy to me that using actions in React, it will queue up form submissions or like submissions. It will queue those up if the JavaScript hasn't loaded and then send all those after the JavaScript has been loaded, which is really, really interesting. And like kind of, I don't know, like you get into like the rage click thing where you click a submit button 4 times and then it actually queues all those up. So behind the scenes, after that JavaScript is loaded, it sends 4 requests to the server, which is not great. Sony said, can we tweet with Laravel yet? Meaning, can I like tweet about Laravel? I streamed yesterday with Josh Siri, right? I confirmed that yesterday. Now I've forgotten. But streamed using PHP Laravel and had a really good time. Really enjoyed it. I think I need to and want to spend some more time just trying to build something and get some more background, just syntactically, I think, and understanding of what's going on. But I thought it all went pretty good. Sony said I had fun watching. Good. I'm glad. Yeah, I had fun. And Sony, thanks for being there and always adding your energy and push for PHP and Laravel and excitement for all the magic that it has to offer. Yeah, so let's see. What do I want to do next? I'm going to have a very quick submission for, do you want to see my hackathon project for, this is going to be a very, very quick thing. Let's see. I'll present this really quickly. Share screen. This one. So this is an AI content generator for developers. And what's going to happen is I'm going to log in. This is using Zeta database, Prisma for the ORM, ingest for like asynchronous stuff, basically running a cron job to send emails. And so what's going to happen is if I go to my dashboard, these are not great examples, but this is AI generated content that I can create by giving it a topic. So what I'm going to say is like partial pre rendering in Next.js versus server islands and Astro, which may not actually do well in this because this stuff is so new. So this is using OpenAI. Anyway, so what's going to happen is I'm going to give it a topic and it's going to generate some posts for me, and it's going to create 3 different ones. It's going to create something that is a joke, something that asks a question, and something that is like a best practice. And so I can go into the review section. It's going to give me ideas for these. So it says the first one is, or those are a few old ones. I think I put some dummy stuff in here. So here's a question here. Which do you prefer for optimizing web performance? Partial pre-rendering in Next.js or server islands in Astro? Gives a couple hashtags. What I can do, I can edit this right here. Then I can click save. And so save then takes it to my upcoming post. And then what's going to happen is ingest is going to kick off a cron job every morning to send me the most recent or the next post and send an email to me with that next post. And then I can go and actually tweet that thing. So in theory, it's like helping me crank out content around a certain topic. The answers are not that great, to be honest. So I would definitely need to do like some refining of the prompts and refining of the prompts and try to get kind of a better idea of that. But then I think it kind of helps spark some ideas of what to create content wise, and then sends you a reminder every day of like, here's a tweet that you can share today based on the stuff we talked about. Stoney said, lock the button with a spinner. Which one of those? Mike said, awesome use case. I was thinking of making a tool, something like this, like the AI version of JSON placeholder. That would be nice. Michael, neat. Don't mean to spam, but check out Payload CMS. Michael, are you just working with? Do you work for Payload? Or are you just working with it and enjoying it? I've heard, and I think they actually reach out to work together too a while back. But I haven't followed up with them. I'm not sure. But yeah, there's a lot going on here. When you hit generate, you get a pop-up, but the button is not loading. It's not loading. I think it is. I don't know if I disable it. Let's see. Next.js server side rendering using streaming and server components. So it should have it may not be disabled, so maybe what you're saying, but it does at least tell you that it's submitting. And this is hackathon project. So Michael, not at all. Just think it's super cool. Okay. Looking for a job. That's right. Okay. Yeah. What are your favorite things about Payload? What are the things that you really enjoy about it? Jordan says, I'm curious if there's a recommendation on structuring components. I like to use an index.ts file to export components in a directory, but I'm unable to do this when I have both server and client components. Unable to do this when I have both server and client components. I've never thought about that. Does that not work that way? Jordan? Well, I'm able to do this when I have both server. Does the bundler can't do like imports? Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. You can. One thing I've been experimenting with is doing like the nested directories inside of the app directory. So you can do underscore directories, which are like hidden from trying to render routes. So inside of a /dashboard folder, you might have a page.tsx, and then I might have an underscore components, underscore actions, underscore blah, blah, blah directory to put stuff in. That's one of the things I've been looking at more to organize it that way. Stoney, you're on your phone and missed it. Yeah, no worries. Move to a bigger screen. Yost, so yeah, Lee was here at the beginning, and then I'm just hanging on a chat. So he was here for the first 35, 40 minutes. Unfortunately, you missed him. Michael said it gives users and developers a very quick and easy to use CRUD and content upload to their website. Less than an hour, you can provide the user with a handful of forms, content for their site. Nice. I like it. Yeah, any tool that enables you to build faster is always a plus. So love that. Cool. I'm gonna run. I actually have I've got a podcast recording at 10:30 that I need to get ready for. So I'm gonna go and do that. But Payload comes with auth. They can build out sections of their site, lessening their dependence on your time. Nice. Free. Cool. Love it. Cool. I'm gonna run, but thank you all for hanging out for the stream. Thanks again to Lee for joining and doing a deeper dive into Next.js and answering questions. If you have additional questions on Next.js, ask those on Twitter and tag them. And if you want to see us do another Q&A thing in the future, tag us both and put some pressure on it. I certainly enjoyed it and love the chance to get to hang out with Lee. So anyways, hope you all have an amazing day. Oh, I forgot to shout out. Chris sent a bunch of, or at least a handful of subs. Chris, thank you. I really appreciate that. All the support. Looking forward to seeing you and a couple other people in just a couple of weeks in person at that conference in Wisconsin. So yeah, sweet. All right. And Yost, yeah, the recording is on YouTube, so you can watch that later. No worries. All right. No raid today. I'm just gonna drop it and catch you all later. But see y'all.